Hello. So we are now in Unit 3 of International Trade. I am Elias. So in this Unit 3, we are going to look at the resources and the trade that will take place. And then within that, we will look at the Heckscher-Ohlin Theory and the Leontief paradox. Specifically, we will look at the HO theory, which is the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and we will look at a model of two-factor economy, and then we will look at the model assumptions. So in this video specifically, we will look at the model of two-factor economy as well as the assumptions. Then in the later videos, we will explore other parts such as the effect of international trade between two-factor economies. Then we'll also look at the political economy of trade, where we'll just look at a preliminary review, and then we will look at the empirical evidence on the Heckscher-Ohlin model, where we'll draw evidence from the Leontief paradox. And away from that, we will look at what accounts for the Leontief paradox, and we will extend our theories by bringing in new theories for international trade in goods for similar factor intensity. And if you want to read more on this unit, you can go to Untitled Chapter number 5 and chapter number 6. Okay, so let's begin with a model of two-factor intensity, two-factor economy. So the HO model examines the basis for comparative advantage. So where we are coming from in the theories, we've looked at reasons why nations should trade, and we observe that nations will trade based on the comparative advantage. But now, with the Heckscher-Ohlin model, we want to examine the basis for that comparative advantage, not just identifying the comparative advantage as a basis for trade. So the Heckscher-Ohlin model examines the effect that trade has on factor earnings in the two nations. So we move away from the costs and those other things. Then we want to look at the effects of the factor earnings. That's the wage and the rental price of capital, which we can simply call the interest. So simply put, the Heckscher-Ohlin theory focuses on the difference in relative factor endowments and factor prices between nations as the most important determinants of trade. So where we are coming from, we looked at the mercantilists, we looked at the absolute advantage, we moved on to the comparative advantage as the basis for trade. But here now we are looking at factor prices as well as factor endowment as being the main determinant of trade. Okay, so let's now bring in the what constitutes the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So this theory will be made up of two theorems, namely the HO theorem, which deals with and predicts the pattern of trade. So when we look at the HO theory, we'll just look at the prediction of trade as well as the pattern of trade. Then the factor price equalization theorem, which deals with the effect of international trade on factor prices. So we'll look at the reversal and then see what happens. Okay, so let's state our theorem, our HO theorem. So the HO theorem states that a nation will export the commodity whose production requires the intensive use of the nation's relatively abundant and cheap factor, and export the commodity whose production requires the intensive use of the nation's relatively scarce and expensive factor. Now, what you will see is that where we are coming from, we have looked at factor intensity in terms of production. So here we want to look at now factor abundance in terms of production. So what we are saying in short here is that the relatively labor-rich nation exports the relatively labor-intensive commodity and import the relatively capital-intensive commodity. If Zambia, for example, is labor abundant, meaning it has more labor, it means that Zambia will produce the commodity that responds more to labor and therefore export those commodities. And because Zambia is rich in labor but poor in, say, capital, it means then that Zambia will have to import the commodities that respond more to capital. Therefore, in short, we are saying the labor-rich nation, Zambia in this case, will export the labor-intensive commodity and import the capital-intensive commodity. Let's move to the assumptions of the HO theorem, and then later on we will develop the theorem to see other things. So let's begin with assumption number 1. The first assumption we make under this theorem is that there are two nations, nation 1 and nation 2. These two nations produce two commodities, commodity X and commodity Y. And in producing these two commodities, these two nations use two factors of production, that is, labor and capital. Now, assumption 1 is made in order to be able to illustrate the theory with a two-dimensional figure. That is, we want, if we have a lot of nations, a lot of commodities, and a lot of factors of production, we may not be able to tell the true direction of trade and what would be the basis for such factor intensities. Therefore, we want to keep the analysis simple and only focus on two nations, two commodities, and two factors of production. In the appendix of Dominic Salvatore, which is our main book, you will find a case where we have many nations, many commodities, and many factors of production. So what we see is that making this assumption will not change anything about the stance of the theorem. So this, even if you relax it or you keep it the way it is, it will not change the direction of the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. The second assumption that we make is that both nations use the same technology in production. This means that both nations have access to and use the same general production techniques. For example, if nation 1 uses the Cobb-Douglas production function, it means that nation 2 will also adopt the Cobb-Douglas production function. This is to mean that if factor prices were the same in both nations, producers in both nations would use exactly the same amount of labor and capital in the production of each commodity. That is, in the production of commodity X and in the production of commodity Y. Now, because factor prices usually differ, it means that producers in each nation will use more of the relatively cheaper factor in the nation to minimize their cost of production. As such, both nations will be assumed to use the same technology to avoid major ambiguities in the theory. The third assumption that we make is that commodity X is labor intensive while commodity Y is capital intensive in both nations. This means that when you are in nation 1, X is labor intensive and Y is capital intensive. When you are in nation 2, X is still labor intensive and Y is still capital intensive. That is to say, commodity X requires relatively more labor to produce than commodity Y in both nations. And commodity Y requires relatively more capital to produce than commodity X in both nations. Okay, this implies then that labor capital ratio L over K, remember we use L for labor and K for capital, is higher for commodity X than for commodity Y in both nations at the same relative factor prices. Now, it should be noted here, which is key, that this does not mean that labor capital ratio for X is the same in both nations. It is possible that labor could be more in nation 1 than it is in nation 2, or capital could be less in nation 1 than it is in nation 2. Or what is known here is that the labor capital ratio for each nation, so the labor capital ratio is high in nation 1 compared to for commodity X compared to commodity Y, and the same labor capital ratio is high in nation 2 in the production of commodity X compared to the production of commodity Y. The fourth assumption is that both commodities are produced under constant returns to scale in both nations. What this means is that increasing the amount of labor and capital used in the production of any commodity will increase output of that commodity in the same proportion. For example, if we scale up each of the factor inputs by say 2, say we double labor and we double capital, it means that the output of the commodity produced will also double. That means we have constant returns to scale. Let me take this opportunity to assume a Cobb-Douglas production function. Let's assume we have a function f, which is a function of labor and capital, and this function takes the form, let's say L to the power 0.5 and L to the power 0.5. Sorry, so we have L and K. We need to have L and K. Okay, so this is our Cobb-Douglas production function. If we scale up each of these inputs, let's say we double the inputs. So we scale up each input by say 2. So we have 2L, 2K, and this will mean we will have 2L, because now it means where we had L, we raised L to the power 0.5. Where we had K, we raised K to the power 0.5. Now that instead of having L, we have 2L, it means we are raising 2L to the power 0.5, to the power 0.5, and we are also raising 2K to the power 0.5. And remember that this means this is output Q. Okay? So what we will have then here is that we can distribute the power. So we will have 2 to the power 0.5. Then we have L here to the power 0.5. So I'm using index rule. Then we also have 2 here to the power 0.5. I'm now distributing this part, and then K to the power 0.5. And if I rearrange this, what I will have is that I will have a 2 to the power 0.5 multiplied by 2 to the power 0.5. So now this 2 to the power 0.5 is this one here, and this 2 to the power 0.5 is this one here, meaning I'll remain with L power 0.5 and K power 0.5. So I bring my L power 0.5 here, and my K power 0.5. From there, we see that if I am multiplying two numbers which have the same bases, or two indices which have the same bases, then we add the powers. So meaning 2 to the power 0.5 times 2 to the power 0.5 is the same as saying 2 to the power 0.5 plus 0.5, which will be 2 to the power 1, which will just be 2. Meaning that this part then will reduce to 2 L power 0.5 and K power 0.5. which is simply now, because this part here, this L power 0.5 and K power 0.5 is equal to Q, it means that what I have then is 2Q. So we see that by scaling up each of the inputs used in the production process by 2 or by doubling each input, we are seeing that even output is also responding proportionately. Therefore, we have what we call the constant returns to scale. And this is true in both nations. Okay, so the fifth assumption is that there is incomplete specialization in production in both nations, meaning that both nations are producing both commodities X and Y, and no nation is only producing a single commodity. What that means is that even with free trade, both nations will continue to produce both commodities, and that both nations are large. There is no small nation. Assumption 6 that we make here is that tastes are equal in both nations. And if tastes are equal, this means that then the demand preferences, which we depict using indifference scales, are identical in both nations. That is, both nations have identical tastes when it comes to their consumption patterns. So what we see then is that when relative commodity prices are equal in both nations, then both nations will consume X and Y in the same proportion because their tastes are equal. So if prices are equal, then even consumption patterns will follow suit. Assumption 7 is that there is perfect competition in both commodities, in both commodities and factor markets in both nations. So when we are looking at commodity market, we are looking at the market for commodity X and commodity Y, which we are producing. And when we are looking at the factor market, we are looking at the market for labor and capital. So in both markets, there is perfect competition. This means that producers, consumers, and traders of commodity X and Y in both nations are each too small to affect the prices of these commodities. In the same way, perfect competition would also mean that in the long run, commodity prices equal their cost of production. And when you look at the factor market, the producers have no powers to affect the factor prices. They take everything as given. Why? Because there is perfect flow of information. If one seller increases the price of a commodity, when the other seller has not, it means consumers will run to the seller who has a lower price and leave the one whose price has gone up, because information is flowing freely and perfectly within the market. Assumption 8 is that there is perfect factor mobility within each nation, but no international factor mobility, meaning that the factors of production can move within the nation from one industry to the other, but they cannot cross the borders to go and be used in another nation. What we see then is that labor and capital are free to move, and the movement is quickly from areas and industries of lower earnings to areas and industries of higher earnings, until earnings for the same type of labor and capital are the same in all areas, all uses and industries of the given nation. So when the people, say, let's assume that the labor units have information that there is a company that is paying more for doing the similar job, you will notice, and if possible, maybe you have already noted, that people are likely to move from one industry to the other to go and get a higher earning. But when earnings are equalized, it means there will be no incentive apart from one just getting utility from a certain job. There will be no incentive for them to move and go into another industry to go and perform the same task and get the same amount. Otherwise, people are rational. They would rather stay in one job and maintain their earnings and their job utility. The assumption number 9 that we make is that there are no transportation costs. tariffs, or other obstructions to the free flow of international trade. Here, we see that specialization in production proceeds until relative or absolute commodity prices are the same in both nations with trade. There would be something funny if this was not the case. If we allowed for transportation costs and tariffs, specialization would proceed only until relative or absolute commodity prices differed by no more than the cost of transportation and the tariffs on each unit of the commodity traded. But because we are assuming that there are no these transportation costs, then it means then that specialization in production proceeds until the commodity prices are equal and not necessarily related to the cost of production or transportation. Assumption 10 is that all resources are fully employed in both nations. So there are no resources that are lying idle. In other words, if we are on the production, we are assuming the production frontier, then the nations are producing on the PPF, that is, on the production frontier and not inside the production frontier. Further, this means that there are no unemployed resources or even factors of production in either nation. Lastly, we assume that international trade between the two nations is balanced. This means that the exports are equal to imports. Or simply put, this means that the total value of each nation's export equals the total value of each nation's import. So with these assumptions, we will build our theory in the next video, where we will start looking at the Heckscher-Ohlin in more details. So thank you very much for watching. If you have questions on these assumptions, please send an email to muauelias@gmail.com. I will see you in session 2.